Gia Carangi is a legend in the fashion industry. She is believed to be one of the first supermodels in the world. Her unique and magnetic looks landed her on the covers of Vogue and Cosmopolitan. She appeared in advertising campaigns for Armani, Versace, and Dior. But it wasn't just her beauty. She is remembered for her wild, fiery personality. She was not afraid to express herself. She made fashion statements ahead of her time. She embraced androgynous style, she dressed in men's clothes and didn't wear any makeup. Quote, Gia dressed street chic way before its time, and she's the one who brought that look right into Vogue magazine. She'd wear black pants and white men's shirts and black flat pumps, wear a motorcycle jacket, and of course the beat-up jeans. And she made it so stylish, she looked so stunning. You could put a woman in a couture gown next to her and she looked better. She was the only one to do that in modeling at that time. End quote. Gia was open about her love for women, and in a way, she revolutionized the gay world. As one of her lovers said, quote, Before we went out together, it was always butch-femme couples where there was one masculine and one feminine girl. We were seen as two femmes. I mean, really, Gia was a butch, she dressed like a boy. But she wasn't the kind of butch that Philadelphia girls were, muscular, big. To them, Gia was a femme because of her aesthetics. We were, I think, pretty much a shock to them. End quote. I think the way many people found out about the real Gia Carangi and the way people are still discovering her is by watching a 1998 television biopic about her life starring Angelina Jolie. At least that was my case. When I first watched this movie in my teens, I felt such gut-wrenching loneliness. This movie was not about the modeling business or the drug addiction. This was a story about a person who was never chosen by people, a person who was never loved the way they needed to be loved. It was crazy for me to see that a woman could be both masculine and feminine and that you don't have to pick a side. Moreover, you don't have to look a certain way to be attracted to girls. I don't know, seeing this woman, who is a model, so she's objectively viewed as attractive and feminine. Basically, in people's eyes, she's the standard of what a woman should be. Seeing her being totally infatuated with other women was so groundbreaking for me. I discovered that femme couples existed or something, I guess. So all in all, the movie made an impact. Rewatching it recently after all those years made me realize that sometimes it's better not to rewatch some movies in order not to ruin the nostalgia. Don't get me wrong, Gia is not the worst movie per se. It's made for TV, so you can't really expect a lot. The main thing that bothers me is the mock documentary style of it. Instead of a somewhat chronological summary of Gia's life, the flow of the story gets interrupted by fake interview bits with your friends, family, and colleagues, and that takes you out of the experience. It's like the movie cannot find the right tone.
Absolutely horrendous.
Even without the interviews, it's not cohesive, it's just a cluster of scenes. It also didn't help that I read Stephen Fried's book about Gia called Thing of Beauty prior to rewatching the movie. The biopic really pushes the wild child persona to the maximum. Don't know if it's the writing or the acting or both, but some scenes seem over the top.
G-I-A.
Obviously, it's easy to mess up a biographical film about somebody. Angelina Jolie felt the same way. Quote, I didn't want to do the part. It was such a heavy story and deals with so many issues. If done wrong, it could have been very bad, and it could have been very exploitive. I think everybody involved with this film was coming from a place that was very deep inside them. She was so human to us, and we all loved aspects of her, and we all identified with certain things. It became very personal. End quote. For Jolie, this role was, in a way, a breakthrough. Lisa from Girl Interrupted and Gia are cousins, might even be the same character. Angelina got a Golden Globe for Gia, and while celebrating her win, she jumped into the pool and pulled a field producer in with her. This alone can tell you why she was cast to play Gia. I suppose the main reason why so many people are still captivated by Gia Carangi is because there is not a lot of information about her, especially information that would come directly from her. Oftentimes, it's he said, she said situation. You have 2 books about her, 2 documentaries, 1 movie, 2 interviews that can hardly be called interviews. People don't really know what she sounded like. Gia is a mystery, and that allows people to morph her into whatever they want. Different people relate to different aspects of her life. It can be sexuality and being gay, relationship with your mother and family, mental struggles, including depression and fear of abandonment, dealing with addictions, or feeling like a fraud and having imposter syndrome. There's so many things you can add to this list. The fact that Gia was a supermodel is secondary to everything else. Since there are not a lot of videos about Gia, and since I had her photo on my bedroom wall for the majority of my teen years, here's the story of Gia Carangi. You see somebody like her, and you become more aware of the human condition at its extreme end. Here's a girl who is extremely beautiful and in extreme pain. And you have to ask yourself, why is someone who looks this way in so much pain? Gia's complicated relationship with her mother, Kathleen, is believed to be the cause of one of her deepest wounds that kept haunting her almost till the very end. Growing up as the youngest kid and the only girl in the family had a significant impact on her character. Some relatives recall her as a certainly needy and spoiled but pretty shy and quiet kid. She was very strong-minded and would always try to get her mom's attention. She was definitely considered by many to be a mama's girl. Gia's aunt Nancy noted, quote, "Gia kind of kept to herself. You know, shy people, as they get older, you're not as conscious that they're shy. They're quiet, they're intellectual, they're withdrawn. I think they thought she was either shy or miserable. They weren't sure which, but she was always pretty bratty." End quote. Gia, on the contrary, felt that being a girl in her family was isolating. She wrote about her childhood and her dad, quote, "My dad was always working, and when he was around, he paid more attention to my brothers. I would try to get his attention, and he would reject me by putting me down, making fun of me, teasing me. He would do this in front of my brothers. I felt like they were better than me, and the only difference was that they were boys. I feel my father never gave me what I needed growing up, which was love, understanding, time. He never gave me the time of day. When I was little, my parents had this big closet. I used to go in there to play dress up. Instead of choosing my mom's clothes to look at, I would look at my dad's. I would go into my brother Joe's closet and try his clothes on. I think I thought if I was a boy, my father would love me." End quote. Gia's parents had a very turbulent relationship. Her father Joe owned a chain of hoagie shops, so he was always at work, while her mother Kathleen was a homemaker. At first, there were just teasing and small arguments here and there. Having an 11-year age gap between them, Kathleen was still pretty young. Some relatives thought she craved a lot of attention from her husband, that she was demanding. Kathleen, though, believed that Joe was too jealous and that caused a lot of problems. Eventually, the tension between the two escalated into physical abuse. One incident that became the last straw for Kathleen was when Joe tried to examine her to see if she had slept with another man. This was reenacted in the movie. It was so traumatic that Kathleen tried to end her life. In the end, she decided it was best to just leave. She commented on that decision later, quote, "He was going to kill me or I was going to kill him. There have been times when I thought, for the sake of the children, maybe I should have tried to work it out more. But leaving them with him was the only way I could get out. He never would have let me take them. And I really never thought it would hurt them as badly as it did." End quote. Gia was 11 when it happened, and obviously for any child this would feel like a betrayal. Gia's brothers said that they were left unattended for the most part. There was no discipline in the house. The kids could do whatever they wanted. Quote, "Gia was the youngest. The breakup affected her the worst. And I feel girls need more attention than boys anyhow." End quote. Gia's aunt Nancy stated, quote, "She couldn't understand why her mother had left, why her parents weren't together. I don't think she ever understood it, and she was totally unsupervised." End quote. Kathleen claimed that she didn't abandon her children, that she was always around. She would come and visit them, and later Joe allowed the kids to visit their mother at her place. Eventually, Gia moved in with her mother and her stepfather Henry when she was around 14 years old. The mother-daughter relationship was still very complex. It was hard for Kathleen to understand some aspects of her daughter's identity. During that time, Gia became a Bowie kid. That subculture was thriving in Philadelphia. She cut her hair to resemble the bushy Bowie hairstyle. She started experimenting with makeup and clothes. She was going through her rebellious phase. Even though Kathleen was in shock at first, she handmade a red satin jumpsuit for Gia and even went to some concerts with her. However, Kathleen's main concerns were drugs and alcohol. Gia was known to provide her school friends with pot and pills because her brother had connections. One time, while Kathleen was going through her daughter's belongings in search for drugs, she instead found a love letter that Gia had written to another girl. Kathleen never fully accepted her daughter's sexuality. She sent her to a counselor that surprisingly told Gia that there was nothing wrong with being gay. This facet of Gia's life has been questioned quite a lot. Some people viewed her more as a bisexual, others said that she was the purest lesbian they had ever met. Later in life, when Gia was undergoing rehab treatments, some therapists and counselors thought that all her problems stemmed from her being sexually confused, or that Gia's sexual inclinations were the result of sexual abuse she experienced when she was a kid. Gia actually opened up to Kathleen that when she was around 6 years old, she was abused by a neighbor, but she never specified whom exactly. Some people believed Gia was abused by her own father. I like how the movie deals with Gia's sexuality. First of all, they don't put her into a specific box. They don't question her, and she doesn't question herself. Jolie's character is shown to have a relationship with both men and women. She loves who she wants to love or flirts with whom she wants to flirt. It's that simple. And second of all, the relationship between two women, Gia and the makeup artist Linda, are handled with a lot of care. They're not sexualized in my opinion, they're not made into some kind of spectacle. The movie generally feels more like a love story than a real-life account. Over the next few years, Gia would indulge her wild nature to the full. She would ignore the curfews, shoplift, steal people's credit cards, hang out in gay clubs, and take drugs. The 70s were all about sex, drugs, and rock and roll, so in a way, Gia was doing what everyone else was doing and no more, no less. Quote, I thought she did a lot of this stuff to get her mother's attention. Gia had the kind of personality that yielded to a babysitter sometimes. She needed guidance, whether a mother, a lover, a sister, a nanny. She needed not to be left alone. And the one person she really wanted was her mother. Kathleen obviously wanted her own life and wanted her daughter to be strong enough to do it on her own, without her doing anything. End quote. Gia would move back and forth between her parents' houses, but in each house there was a demanding step-parent, who dad remarried to. Amidst all of this, Gia took her first steps into the modeling world. I always thought Gia was accidentally discovered. That's how her story was always presented, even in the movie, almost an overnight success. However, it's not exactly true. It's not clear why Gia gravitated towards modeling. Some people who knew her believed she wanted to please her mother. Kathleen studied retailing in high school, and after graduation, she worked at a women's shop where she helped prepare fashion shows and dress models. Gia had no idea what she wanted to be, but people around her seemed to agree that she was destined to be a model. When Gia was 14, her stepdad's client and friend recommended the family to take Gia to a well-known commercial photographer, Joe Petralis. He did a couple of outdoor shots, in which Gia understandably came off a bit awkward and stiff. Joe pretty quickly became a family's friend. He saw Gia's potential and suggested that she meet his friend and former New York runaway model, who now taught beauty and modeling courses. Gia and her aunt Nancy, who was 21 at the time, both decided to sign up. Besides the modeling classes, Gia also answered an ad for amateur models at a department store and did a second series of tests with Petralis. This time they looked more sophisticated. As Joe recalled, quote, she was born to be in front of the camera. The way she would move, she knew her face, she knew her body. She was born with that. She was born to model. And it was no big deal to her. She was only doing modeling because she needed something to do. End quote. Following another advice from Joe, Gia and Kathleen went to the top modeling agency in Philadelphia that actually accepted Gia and put her in their teen division. But nothing came out of that. No work, no bookings. She was a bit ethnic and exotic for Philadelphia, as they explained later. During this time, Gia was still partying, going to gay clubs with her friends and lovers. On one of those nights, she was spotted by another aspiring fashion photographer in the city, Maurice Tannenbaum. They got along very well and started meeting every week to work together. He said, quote, this girl had done everything by the time she was 16. She had tried almost every drug, had all kinds of sex, and she was going with a very fast crowd. She liked being the center of attention. If I shot her with other people and they got the attention, she'd get pissed. Yet she seemed deep down to be a regular 16-year-old kid, wholesome, loving, involved with her family. She loved kids because they were pure and going to love her for the right reasons. End quote. Kathleen was very encouraging, maybe even a bit pushy sometimes. She took Gia to another model agent, who was really impressed by the work Gia had done so far, and even said that they might send her to Europe. But this didn't happen because ultimately, Maurice Tannenbaum's photo book changed everything. Maurice needed help in his salon, so he hired a makeup artist named Sondra, who was also a former model. When Sondra saw photos of Gia in Maurice's photo book, she was blown away. She immediately contacted her good friend, Wilhelmina Cooper, a top model who owned her own agency in New York. 2 days later, Gia was already there. In 1978, at age 17, she signed with Wilhelmina Models. Gia had to move to New York. However, she didn't want to live alone there, so she asked her ex-lover and friend to be her roommate. They would eventually part ways. Afterwards, Gia's brother Michael would express his regrets. Quote, the mistake we made was that nobody went with her. She could have used a friend. Of course, she said she didn't want anyone, but she could have used me or her mother. Sometimes she would ask me to look for a job in New York. I didn't realize until later that she wanted me to be up there for her. End quote. Gia's first test shoot was a nerve-wracking experience. Sondra was there, so she managed to capture Gia in this moment with her own camera. Quote, Gia was extremely nervous to be shooting with professional models and was convinced that they didn't like her. To help ease her fears and calm her, I suggested we take a few shots and encouraged her to look in the mirror and see that she was their equal, or better. As she leaned into the mirror, at that moment I saw and captured the face that would impact the world of modeling forever. End quote. For the first couple of months, Gia was running around the city going on different go-sees. According to Gia's ex-lover, she hated it. She felt like a piece of meat, but she was still good at it. She was playing the game. The first test shoot that made a big push in Gia's career was the black leather jacket photo shoot with Lance Stedler. Gia came to his studio with messy hair, so he decided to do a heavy smoky eye on her and also lent her his jacket. Gia managed to make some copies for her portfolio, and it went only uphill from there. She did pictures for Bloomingdale ads and layouts for Vogue and Harper's Bazaar. She traveled to Europe to shoot in Rome, Paris, and Milan. She was being booked by the top photographers. Francesco Scavullo, best known for his work on the covers of Cosmopolitan, was mad about Gia. Quote, "She wasn't stylized, she didn't pose. She was like an actress in front of the camera. She had her own little way of modeling. She jumped around. It was a challenge to photograph her, to follow her. There are very few models who experiment like that and do it well. But with Gia, it was like you were getting candid pictures of her. She had the perfect body for modeling, and to me, the perfect attitude. She didn't give a damn. So she threw the clothes away, which I loved." End quote. Another famous fashion photographer, Chris von Wangenheim, believed that Gia's figure was unbeatable. He really wanted to do some real nudes of her, and that's how the most well-known fence shoot came to be. This was also the moment when Gia felt something for her makeup artist Sandy Linter. Chris made both of them stand naked on the opposite sides of the fence. The photos turned out to be striking and thrilling. Gia and Sandy became linked both in private and professional life. They were a package deal for fashion business. Their romantic relationship, however, is clouded by speculation, since Sandy is still on the fence about whether they had a love affair or not. People who were close to Gia remember her being very heartbroken because of Sandy, and I guess that's what the movie tries to portray too.
You were the only one. And you were amazing.
Gia was really unlucky in love. Sandy was not the first person to disappoint her and say, "Oh, actually I like men and not women." One of Gia's high school friends said, quote, "Gia just loved women and she felt for them whether they were straight or gay. And the problem was that everyone fell in love with her, whether they were straight or not, male or female. She went after people and she always got them." End quote. When Gia first got to New York, she tried dating men, but she would always end up gravitating more towards women. The relationship with women, though, were not stable. Lots of fighting, sometimes drugs. Some of her ex-lovers described her as needy. She couldn't be alone, she couldn't take care of herself, and had a fear of abandonment that she very likely developed because of her mother. At the same time, she was still a kid, just entering her 20s. Gia would always call her mother, and Kathleen would visit her in New York when she could, often coming in to do the laundry. Much of the time, though, Gia was alone. She got interested in documentary photography and cinematography, and to fill in her time, she signed up for a photography course at New York University. Unfortunately, due to her tight schedule, she soon had to drop out. Gia would take a number of courses throughout her short life. She had a desire to make her own movie, but sadly it was not meant to be. Within 2 years of coming to New York, Gia had a serious drug problem. From the very beginning, she was not an easy person to work with. She didn't care about the industry or celebrities, and a lot of people were drawn to that kind of attitude. John Stamber, a photographer who worked with Gia, noted, quote, "I had a lot of fun times with her, but basically, if you told Gia black, she would say white. If you told her to go left, she would go right. If you told her to sit there, she would stand. Whatever you told her to do, she would do the opposite, and she did it to the biggest people in the business. They didn't know what hit them. They'd never seen anything like it." End quote. A lot of stories about Gia's tricks and mischief started circulating around. She could come to the set late, she could disappear during the shoot and just go home full glam wearing designer clothes. The movie scene where Gia hops on a random Sky motorbike during the photo shoot and drives into the sunset actually happened in real life. The guy was used for a couple of shots, they just found him on the street, and when they wrapped everything up, Gia just decided to go with him, still wearing the outfit she was given. It took 3 days to get it back. At that point, some people already suspected that something was off, and that Gia might be taking something that could make her behave that way. One time, Gia and a whole team of people, including Francesco Scavullo, had to travel to St. Bart's for a week-long shoot. During the boat ride, Scavullo's assistant found a substance that belonged to Gia, and he threw it overboard. In his own words, Gia got hysterical. She wanted to leave, but somehow she stayed, and the photo shoot was a success. In those days, the drug culture was in full effect. People in the fashion industry knew the models were indulging in those practices just to keep up with their insane schedules and the mental load that comes with this type of job. Nonetheless, if the work was done and the money was there, no questions asked. And if the model wasn't capable of work, well, there was another girl waiting around the corner. And how hard can it be to distance yourself from this if everybody else around you is doing it, and it's actually weird not to do it, and moreover, people you work with can supply you with a bag of whatever substance you want. People didn't know how to deal with this, but they were also not prioritizing this problem and fighting it. The pivotal moment that made everything even worse for Gia was the death of Wilhelmina in 1980. She died of lung cancer. Gia was devastated because she saw a mother figure and a role model in Wilhelmina. When Gia had problems, she would go right to her. The movie showcases the warmth of their relationship very well. Gia wrote in her journal, quote, "I don't know what is happening in my life. Nothing seems or feels right to me. I want to live so bad, but I'm so terribly sad. I wish Wilhelmina didn't die. She was so wonderful to talk to about work. I cry every day for a little while. I wish I knew what to do. I pray that things fall into place." End quote. Gia's addiction to heroin began shortly after. She started working less frequently, sometimes skipping bookings altogether or showing up high. If a booking was ruined because of her, she often had to pay the other models' fees. The agency did suggest Gia seek drug counseling, but she went to a celebrity nutritionist instead. They tried curing her with diet regime and vitamin B. Kathleen said that the agency never contacted her about any drug problems. But later she admitted that for a long time she was in denial herself. Quote, "I was very naive. In the beginning she talked about everything that was happening in New York, but later she would not answer questions. But I should have realized. I always believed what she told me, and I only realized later that she would call me up when things were bad and tell me everything except what was really the matter. Because I loved her so much and really didn't want to believe that any awful things could be happening, I was just blind to it. I can remember one day I was in New York and she was probably trying to tell me. She took me out to dinner. She wasn't right. She kept saying, 'I have this big problem.' And I kept saying, 'Well, Gia, you are a survivor like me. Whatever this problem is, you'll work it out. You'll get over it." End quote. In the movie, Gia's mother is portrayed to be so naive and clueless that it becomes comical. Mercedes Ruehl, the actress who plays Kathleen in the movie, really nailed the dynamic between the mother and the daughter. Quote, "Drugs are a manifestation of the problem, but the real problem is the wound. In the screenplay, we have a mother with a narcissistic wound and a daughter who is narcissistically wounded herself, from a kind of heartbreaking neglect. They are both having to get through the day with massive tricks of denial." End quote. After Wilhelmina's death, Gia made the decision to leave the agency and sign with Ford. However, she was dropped within a couple of weeks. In 1981, 2 weeks after her 21st birthday, Gia moved back to Philadelphia to live with her mother and stepfather. She attempted to quit drugs by entering a detox program, but soon she fell back into old habits. At one point, Gia got into a car accident and was arrested. At last, she robbed her mother and disappeared. Gia sought refuge at her old friend's place, and near the end of the year went back to New York in hopes of a comeback to the industry. Elite Model Management signed her, which was a surprise to a lot of people. At that point, everyone knew what kind of problems Gia had, and some thought Elite just wanted to make money off of her. The agency management did say that they encouraged Gia to seek professional help. Gia would only be in New York for work. Kathleen had forgiven her and taken her back. She hoped if her daughter had gotten her modeling career back, everything else would have fallen into place. The first job Gia got was kindly provided by Francesco Scavula. He seemed to truly care about her. He photographed Gia for the 1982 cover of Cosmopolitan. They had to hide the abscess on her arm by having her put her hands behind her back. Scavula's assistant recalled, quote, "What she was doing to herself finally showed in the pictures. It was kind of sad. We got her on the cover, but I could see the change in her beauty. There was an emptiness in her eyes." End quote. Gia also appeared in Scavula's book that included before and after makeup photos of various famous women with their opinions on beauty. Gia commented, quote, "You know, I thank God that I'm good looking, or that people think I'm good looking. But there's a lot more to it than makeup and prettiness and all that stuff. There's a lot more to being a woman than that. When I look in the mirror, I just want to like myself, that's all. And if I like myself, then I look good." End quote. Francesco edited some of her most controversial comments and claimed that her drug problems were in the past, which was far from the truth. Elite convinced Gia to get interviewed for the ABC program 2020. They were doing a report on the modeling business, the bright side and the dark side of it, and the agency thought it could be a good opportunity for publicity if Gia exposed the truth about her struggles. The interview didn't go that well. The reporter was pretty bold with his questions, and Gia was thrown off by it.
At one point, you got kind of into the drug scene, didn't you?
Yes, you could say that I did.
When the segment finally aired, it didn't affect Gia's career in any way, because as Stephen Fried writes in the book, there was little left of her reputation in the States. She mostly worked for German clients. During this time, Kathleen took Gia to a surgeon to have her noticeable abscess taken care of. It was described as an open, infected tunnel leading into her vein. Despite being on a methadone program, she started using heroin again. She bought the drugs by borrowing money. Photographer Joe Petralis remembered, quote, "I gave her money. I did the wrong thing, but I didn't know what else to do. I always had a little guilt that if I had talked to her mother and gotten them together, I regret the fact that we didn't all get together and get her into somewhere good, so she could work with a good psychiatrist." End quote. Many people gave her the money because they were afraid of what else she would be willing to do to get it. It was never clear what kind of things Gia endured, but she herself confessed to sleeping with people for money. She also told her friends and mother that she was sexually assaulted more than once. In the same year, Gia and her girlfriend decided to move in with Gia's father and her brother. By the end of 1983, Gia's modeling career finally came to an end. In his book, Stephen Fried explains that the International Model Management Association made an agreement that if a model had a drug problem, they couldn't be represented by any agency. Even though New York agencies dealt with things their own way and the association had no power over them, Elite used this pact to freeze Gia's work. Stephen Fried writes, quote, "Elite's decision seemed justifiable, but at the same time somewhat hypocritical in its lateness. There was nothing very humanitarian about representing an admitted junkie for over a year and then cutting her off for her own good after her earning power had sunk below acceptable levels. But it was, after all, as it always had been, just business." End quote. Gia was going in circles, getting clean and using again. Finally, in 1984, she entered Eagleville detox program as a welfare patient. She stayed there only for 2 weeks. Her Aunt Barbara suddenly died in a car accident, so to be with her family, Gia checked herself out. The relationships within Gia's family were rocky. Her Aunt Nancy and her mother Kathleen weren't on good terms, but despite all the fighting and disagreements, they pushed Gia to re-enter the rehab. During the 7 months of intense therapy, Gia would cry about her mother a lot. Emotionally, she was still a little girl. Quote, "I think Gia was caught in loving her mother and having a lot of hate for her mother for leaving her as a child. She was able to cognitively understand that her father would not have allowed her mother to take her and her brothers. I believe Gia did know that, but she was still stuck with that feeling. Why did you leave me there?" And more of the emotional stuff of being the only girl. End quote. Kathleen began attending some therapy sessions with Gia, and it was clear that they were extremely tied to each other in weird ways. Quote, "I don't think she or mom could separate each other out. They were sort of enmeshed, and Gia was very unhappy with that, but also couldn't detach herself." End quote. By the end of her inpatient program, Gia realized that she had to let go of her mother. The next phase of the program was to slowly get back to normal life. Gia moved into an apartment with 2 other recovering women and got a job as a sales clerk at a clothing store. Her therapists advised her not to move home, but the apartment she shared was pretty depressing, so in 1985, Gia moved back in with her mother. One of her best friends warned her that she would start using again. Gia wrote in her journal, quote, "Hello book, it's now November 16th. I'm at my mom's again and feeling fuck up." End quote. She quit her job at the mall and called Elite and Scavula to let them know that she was okay and drug-free, and that she was thinking of doing modeling again in the coming year. Unfortunately, soon enough, Gia began having suspicions that she might have AIDS. She wasn't feeling good and became a bit obsessed with finding any information about AIDS in newspapers and magazines. At the beginning of 1986, she started using drugs again. She called Eagleville to tell them that she wouldn't be coming to group sessions anymore, so she was discharged. She decided to pawn everything she owned. She sold her car, bought as much heroin as she could afford, went to a cheap hotel and tried to overdose. She was unsuccessful. Months later, Gia was hospitalized after being badly beaten and assaulted on the street. She called her father first, who then put her on the bus back to her mother. Kathleen was the one who took Gia to the hospital, which didn't want to admit her at first due to her being a drug addict. After the doctors ran a series of tests, they found that Gia had bilateral pneumonia, bone marrow depression with anemia, and extremely low blood cells count. She was diagnosed with AIDS-related complex, a precursor to AIDS. There was a lot of false information going around about AIDS, and even doctors at hospitals were extremely paranoid and fearful. They would wear protective suits and rubber gloves just to check on a patient. That's why Gia was put into an isolation ward at first. After spending a week in the medical unit, she was transferred to the psychiatric unit, where she was diagnosed with schizoaffective disorder with some psychotic features and depression. She had talked about suicide and was having hallucinations and feeling paranoid. When Gia was discharged from the hospital, her stepdad Henry didn't want to take her in. So Gia lived together with a friend for some time until Kathleen persuaded Henry to reconsider his decision. Gia's friend actually said that Gia didn't want to go and live with her mother and stepdad, but because her health was deteriorating, that was the best option. At least she could be taken care of. One of Gia's therapists described her behavior at that time, quote, "Gia had good insight. She understood a lot of her problems. I met her when her health was failing. Her physical limitations were so great that her psychological understanding was more in line with her behavior. I saw her in a unique position because she couldn't do what she used to do. She thought of herself as wild. A lot of the wildness was driven by how she felt about herself. It drove her to get attention from her mother, and she did excessive behavior intentionally to get attention." End quote. Gia was getting sicker and sicker, so eventually she had to get hospitalized again. Kathleen became very controlling and overprotective. She would decide who was allowed to visit her daughter, and that of course angered a lot of Gia's friends and ex-lovers and relatives. During Gia's last week of life, no one was allowed to visit her except Kathleen. She decorated Gia's hospital room with yellow roses. They were Gia's favorite. Some of Gia's counselors actually understood Kathleen's behavior. Quote, "I know some people thought it might not have been a good idea, but you have to understand that this was this woman's daughter and they had been fighting for position most of Gia's life. Any woman you talk to who has lost a child, that's the hardest thing, the hardest grief to get over. I think Gia felt that her mother was finally there for her. I believe that people are basically good, and I believe that every parent really loves their kid. They might just not know how to do it in a way that helps their kid. This is what I think Gia came to feel at the end, that her mother did love her, but just didn't know quite how to do it in a way that Gia needed it." End quote. On November 18th, 1986, at the age of 26, Gia passed away. Her death wasn't given much publicity, and sadly not a lot of people attended her funeral. Stephen Fried writes that Kathleen and Henry did their best to contact Gia's friends and colleagues both from Philadelphia and New York. Some of Gia's friends decided not to attend because of Kathleen. Nobody from the fashion industry attended the funeral. One of her stylists recalled, quote, "You know, this will sound awful, but I remember when her father called me and said she died. I wondered why he called me. He said, 'I know you were very good friends with my daughter. It would have been awful for me to deny it, wouldn't it?' End quote. Nonetheless, weeks later, Francesco Scavullo sent a card to Gia's family. He recalled, quote, "We were hysterical crying in the studio when we heard." End quote. There was and still is a lot of finger-pointing over who was to blame for Gia's condition. Kathleen blamed Gia's lovers and friends, some of whom had their own drug problems. Gia's friends and lovers in turn blamed her mother for not giving Gia the love and attention she needed. People blamed the agency and the modeling business and the New York culture. Becoming that successful for sure might have exacerbated Gia's inner demons, but at the end of the day, we are the ones responsible for turning all those traumas into strength. Probably there were individuals who had selfish goals in mind, but most people who knew Gia were normal people with their own unresolved issues. When you read the book, you understand that a lot of Gia's friends and relatives and colleagues felt tremendous guilt and shame for not doing enough, for not noticing something or brushing something off. A lot of them were just scared and didn't know what to do. It's just very sad and tragic that everything that could go wrong went wrong for this one person.
When I hear people say, well, her mother did this, or her mother wasn't that, or her mother, and I think, oh my God, if only they knew how difficult this girl was. She was really difficult.
Gia once said that God had a big plan for her, but that it was not in this life. I believe she completely fulfilled her purpose. She left a huge mark, not only in the fashion world, but in a lot of people's lives, to the point that nobody can forget her face. Cultish yet seductive, tough yet childlike, she was a natural in front of the camera. Even in the simplest seeming, most straightforward photographs, she had an ability to reach out with her eyes and grab your heart.